Welcome everybody to, I guess it's week 8 of Beck. So we are nearing the end of winter quarter. We have had the bi-weekly schedule so far this year, but I wanted to mention that we have talks this week, next week, and the following week. So weeks 8, 9, and 10 we have talks because we moved next week's speaker to next week because of the fires. So, just to announce the upcoming talks, next week is Dan Bowling, also from Stanford University, Music and Health, Biological Foundations and Applications. And then the last talk of the quarter will be Professor Tej Rai, former Beck member, who got his PhD here, who's now a professor at UCSD, and he'll be talking on incentivized punishers and moralistic offenders destabilize cooperation. That's the title. So please join us for those. And then we'll have spring break, and I will announce the schedule for spring soon, probably in the next or two. Today, it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Mike Frank from Stanford University. And Mike will be talking to us about large language models, bridging the gap between children and AI models. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mike.
So thanks very much for having me. Thanks, Clark, for the invitation. Really pleased to be here. I understand this is a very interdisciplinary group, and I'm going to be talking about some work that is also interdisciplinary. So by its nature, that means that some of the things that I talk about will probably be slightly unfamiliar. If that's the case, you should please feel free to interrupt with questions for clarification or theoretical critiques, trenchant arguments against the whole thing. And you don't even have to know which is which. So we have a little bit of time, and I would love to hear from all of you in a back and forth. You don't have to stand on ceremony. Okay, so I'll talk to you a little bit about this relatively new body of research that I've been working on about trying to understand the relationship between AI models when treated as cognitive models and human development. So the guiding question here is what recent progress in AI, which I find inspiring, fascinating, and oftentimes problematic, what can that progress tell us about the human mind? And in particular, can we learn about how children learn through examining these models? Okay, so just a little bit of stage setting and backdrop. I'll go quickly through this, but feel free to stop me if you have questions. So when we talk about large language models, of the commercially available variety like ChatGPT, we're talking about relatively complex, very, very large commercial products that involve both a particular architecture, a transformer neural network that's trained on unsupervised next word prediction. So both that thing, the pre-trained language model, and then also a whole bunch of variously understood magic that the company has put together, sometimes in an openly accessible way, sometimes not, to make the chatbot use that underlying language model in a way that's pleasing and gives good answers to human questions and so forth. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the kind of commercial artifact. I'm mostly going to be talking about this part, which is a pre-trained predictive engine that's trained to predict the next thing with lots of data. But both of these artifacts, both the kind of base model and the chatbot, have many really exciting applications in psychology. This is just a recent review paper where they highlight uses in measurement, creating stimuli, in experimental design, creating confederate designs, and so forth. One thing they don't mention in this is written by some of my colleagues, they don't mention that language models are also useful as models of learning and models of mind. But before we use them in this way, I just want to mention, of course, there's a couple of known technical issues. So hallucination, generation of plausible but incorrect information. This is just a silly example. My colleague Russ Poldrack used to be here at UCLA. So you could ask, this is now quite a while ago, I haven't verified if this error is still true, but you could ask who Wayne Poldrack is and get Russ's bio, and then you could say, are you talking about Russ Poldrack? They say, oh yeah, sorry, I mean Russ. It's not, I do that too, but it's a little worrisome when it's a technical resource. There's some aspects of brittleness. There are a wide variety of concerns around fairness, bias, and toxicity. And of course, these are the subject of a huge amount of technical development, such that last season's worries are this season's development goals, and a new generation of worries are only beginning to rear their heads. And of course, there are a variety of ethical issues and risks around environmental impacts, copyright infringement, economic issues, and output harms. And I share these worries. I don't study them, I don't have much to say about them, but I just want to acknowledge that they exist before we move on. What I'm interested in is how these models can be used, not the commercial pieces, but the general pre-trained engines can be used as scientific models. So again, a little bit of common grounding here. Scientific models are simplifications that enable explanation and reasoning, as well as, in the case of computational models especially, or formal models, prediction and intervention. So one really wonderful thing about scientific models is that they can afford causal interventions that are difficult or impossible to do. That's especially salient to me as a developmental psychologist, where anything you do with kids is difficult or impossible. And so we need model systems that we can intervene on in a more, that was supposed to be a joke. Thank you. All right. So we need to be able to intervene on our model systems. So for example, by training them with impossible languages or altering their input in ways that we can't for human children, right? You can't, occasionally when we think it's ethically viable and perhaps useful, we intervene at great expense on children's lives to try to make it better. But we can't do lots of experiments that are altering their existence for just our intellectual curiosity. Okay, and of course the problem of models is always that they can risk oversimplification, like when you assume a spherical cow. So what does this mean with respect to a large language model, which I'm using as a catch-all here to include models that model purely language and now increasingly models that model vision, so images and even videos in roughly similar formats. What does this mean? Use this as a cognitive model. Philosophers of science often talk about establishing a mapping between a target system, which might be some or all of the human learning system, and some model system. So the idea is that you've got some model mechanism mapping where you're mapping between part of the substructure of the human system and the model system. And because LLMs are learning models, that's always an input to output type of mapping. And then once that kind of mapping is established, whether for the whole human system or more commonly for perception or psycholinguistic processing or something like this, you can then do all kinds of interesting causal interventions at various different levels. For example, you can do controlled rearing experiments where you alter the input data and measure the effects on the model's learning behavior and performance downstream. That's very tough to do, even in animal models where it's possible. You can do probing. This is more like neuroscience on the models, but you could investigate the causal dependency between some internal state of the model, the numbers and the parameters and so forth, and the observed behavior. That's pretty cool because you can actually go in and tweak those numbers in ways that are difficult or impossible to do in model systems that are in vivo. And you can do basic behavioral evaluation, like doing psychology experiments on the models by feeding in stimuli and getting out some kind of responses. I want to take a moment to have a little soapbox here because this is only true if you have open LLMs. If you have an OpenAI product like ChatGPT, you can't retrain the model, so you can't do controlled rearing. You actually don't even know what the rearing data are. You can't examine the representations. You certainly can't intervene on them because those are locked up. Those are proprietary information. You can evaluate new scenarios, and lots of people have done this by putting in psychological experiments or other kinds of experiments into ChatGPT. But you have no guarantee that you could get the same answer back next week. My Wayne Poldrack example probably doesn't work anymore, and I have no recourse to go reproduce that. It was just on some version of the model from 6 months ago. So there's this very nice paper called Using Cognitive Psychology to Understand GPT-3. This is Binns and Schultz. There's now many more in this genre, but I just want to highlight this one because I think it's interesting. You could also have called this Using Only Cognitive Psychology to Understand GPT-3 because all of the other tools that should be available weren't. Okay, so if you have an open LLM or other predictive language model type artifact, you have an opportunity, which is to use that model as a model of human learning. And the basic thesis of this talk is we can realize that opportunity via the use of specific data sets. Namely, we have to train the model on what kids get, and we have to evaluate the model on what kids learn. That's basically all I want to tell you about today. First part of the talk is children's training data. Second part of the talk is children's learning outcomes. I wish I could tell you that I had completed the dots, connected the dots here, and I have trained a model on children's training data and evaluated on children's learning outcomes, but I haven't totally gotten there yet. I'll show you some examples where people have gotten little ways there, but it's still work in progress. Why would you want to do this kind of exercise? It's not just because you want to build a baby, although that would be kind of cool. It's because you want to contrast different possible models of learning and make inferences based on their success in replicating children's learning outcomes, right? If you have some, let's say, extreme empiricist position, you say no structure is necessary to learn the full structure of human knowledge and cognition. It's just going to be learned from the distribution of the data. This is an experiment that could try to help you substantiate that as a proof of concept. You train a predictive agent on all of a child's experience, and if you get out that child, then you feel really good about that hypothesis. If you want to contrast it with some agent that has more innate structure, whether that's in terms of knowledge or just architectural assumptions of the model, you can make that contrast. Or if you care about active and social learning, you can create an active and social learning model and try to make that contrast. So it's by comparing between different models that are trained on the same data and evaluated in the same way that we can make scientific inferences from cognitive models. Okay. So one big problem when we think about applying this vision is that children's training data is actually much, much smaller than what we see in even the smallest of current available models. So what I'm plotting here is the child's age in years, or the person's age in years, and the approximate words of linguistic input that we estimate a human could have been exposed to. I'm giving you an upper bound and a lower bound here. The upper bound is for somebody who is receiving a lot of language input at home. Their parents are talking to them a lot as a kid, and then they learn to read, and then they're reading a lot. And that's going to get them maybe to 1 billion words if they really stretch. Maybe, but probably not. Probably like 500 million words. But by age 5, they're going to have seen 60 million words maybe. And the lower bound here is about an order of magnitude lower than that. That's something like 6 million words. Okay, when you look at GPT-3, which is our first language model to do really cool stuff by some totally arbitrary metric, seemed really cool at the time. That was 500 billion. Chinchilla did more cool stuff. That was 1 trillion. GPT-4o, we don't know because nobody has told us how much data it got, but we think it's about 15 trillion words. So we've got a data gap. That's a prima facie first comparison between LLMs and humans, and it's a kind of problematic one from the perspective of using LLMs as cognitive models because we've got somewhere between 3 and 6 orders of magnitude of data between the two. Okay, so that's a very heuristic way of defining a data gap. We could do it a little bit more precisely with a task. I just said GPT-3 does cool stuff, but what does it do that's cool? Well, let's pick something. Maybe it's producing grammatical sentences, or maybe it's some common sense reasoning task that it does reasonably well at. So for some specific task, we could define a human compatible metric, one that we could at least get some humans to do, maybe even some small children to do, and then we could plot some age level of performance according for the amount of data that a particular kid gets or a particular age of kid gets. And then we could plot how the model scales with increasing data. And that would allow us to define a data gap. So this is the kind of picture that I'm going to show you, which is how well a model does relative to how well we think it should be doing for that amount of data if it were learning as efficiently as a human does. Why would we want to define these data gaps? Well, I was sort of signaling to different contrasts between various theories of learning. Being a little bit more explicit, we might use that data gap or that scaling as a way of evaluating different hypotheses about the efficiency of learning. So maybe a nativist might say that most of the gap between humans and LLMs is actually the innate endowment, the concepts that a human child has access to that the LLM doesn't. The LLM maybe eventually gets there with a lot of data in some cases, but it takes a lot more time and a lot more training. In contrast, a constructivist view of human development emphasizes the role of active and social learning. And so the argument there would be the LLM gets this passive stream of web text, sometimes unconnected sentences. There's no sense of active learning, so exploration and learning. There's no sense of being curated for you by an adult who's trying to communicate to you or teach you. Maybe that makes the difference. Maybe it's just that human children learn from the multimodal world. Their experience is grounded in vision, in somatosensation, and so forth. And it's just more bits of information coming in. Or maybe this is all just apparent differences, not real differences. And the real difference is just in evaluation. We don't expect that our 5-year-olds can translate between Mandarin and English and know all the facts in Wikipedia, whereas we do hope for that for most of our LLM agents. Okay, so again, I'm going to deflate your expectations here because I can't actually tell you the answer here. It would be cool if I were just like, now I'm going to solve all of human development. But I can at least tell you where I think we're going, which is to get data sets to try to evaluate these hypotheses. And that's what my lab does. That's what we've been doing since pre-LLM days. We build open data resources. We have built a variety of resources to try to capture children's language input, their processing, and their language outcomes. And although that won't be mostly on display today, in most of these cases, we've tried to aim for more representative, larger data sets, that is, with more cross-linguistic and cross-cultural diversity than previous data resources for studying child language. Okay, so we are going to be thinking about training on children's data and evaluating on children's learning outcomes. Let me pause here before I start talking about what those training data look like. Questions about this general setup? Yeah.
Can you reiterate what grounding is in the multimodal grounding?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's like the horrible way that computer scientists have taken the symbol grounding problem and the sort of general philosophical backdrop. So the idea is like, this gets used as shorthand for like having more than just words. Having visual input. So kids don't just hear words, those words are embedded in their visual experience. They're actually hearing sounds, not words in most cases, or seeing signs. They have smell and taste and somatosensation and so forth. And those might be argued to be the substrate in which the meanings of those words are grounded. Yes.
Can you, of those same pieces, so like memory and selection of, what to pay more attention to, what chunk does that fall into?
Yeah. So there's a separate set of questions about the cognitive constraints of the agent, that human learners are imperfect in their memory for the data, and they attend selectively. Basically, my answer here is they're not in that picture, because those are factors that would weigh against the human, and we're currently treating the human as the standard for efficiency. Like it's funny that we say humans are such bad, learners. They only, this is true, right? We don't remember stuff. We can't attend to more than one thing at once. We're slow, and yet we're still more efficient than the LLMs by 3 orders to 6 orders of magnitude.
Sure, you could look at it like we have bad memories compared to ChatGPT, but like that also seems to be key to the efficiency, right? Like that we are able to be efficient because we don't treat every single thing that we hear equally, right? We preference things, and so we select, whether it's conscious or unconscious, we selectively remember things.
Yeah, this is a great question. So there is a thread there, right? There's Alyssa Newport and subsequent theorists have talked about the importance of starting small, and they hypothesized that human cognitive constraints actually made language learning easier. I would say that particular instantiation of the idea, which I'm not pinning on you, but just talking to that particular idea, I would say has largely been falsified by current successes, that was predicated on the idea that language was hard to learn and that you needed to have additional constraints in place. And it turns out language is not so hard to learn. Like understanding the structure of human knowledge and common sense reasoning, that's still hard. But language turns out to be easier than that, which is, I think, a huge discovery and surprise. There still might be a role for smart biases in our learning. So maybe we could lump those under nativism, but not a content nativism, but an architectural nativism. Maybe that's a way to accommodate them in this framing.
I was wondering, you mentioned it in the discussion of ethics about energy costs. I'm wondering if there's a role, thinking about how evolution operates. Of course, you want to see how good these models are, but it really does matter how costly they are in terms of resources also. So, is there a framework to put that into the discussion of, relative performance or fitness, if you will, of different approaches to this?
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting work on more efficient learning rules, which I am not an expert on it in any sense. So my colleague Surya Ganguly, occasional collaborator, does some work on this, and it's fascinating stuff because that is a key set of constraints on human brain evolution, is the vast energetic cost of our computing hardware. I don't have much to say about it here, just to be totally honest, but I think it is very interesting. Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. These are really interesting questions. So let me tell you a little bit about developmental training data. So let's start with just a basic hypothesis. This just gets our table stakes going. Maybe kids just grow up in really linguistically enriched environments that are really good for learning, and their grown-ups just are giving them the right language to help them learn fast. And that's the basic difference between kids and machines. And if you raised an LLM like a kid, it would work much better. Okay, so we can do this experiment. We take GPT-2 small, which is just our kind of off-the-shelf early predecessor of ChatGPT. Basically the same architecture, just way smaller. It does way less stuff, but we can train it on institutional GPU resources without much problem. So this has become kind of our little Drosophila, not ours, but the field little Drosophila for computational experiments on training LLMs. And we trained this model on the Child Language Data Exchange System. That's the web archive Brian McWhinney curates of like all the transcripts of parents talking to children and various other experiments with children that have been done over the years. And there's like 29 million words or something of this kind of stuff. So that's not a lot of data. That's like a little bit less than a 5-year-old, right? Maybe it's in the middle of the 5-year-old range here. But childless it's transcript, it's messy, maybe we need to clean this up. So we actually created this new thing called Tiny Dialogues, which is what GPT-4 would think is a dialogue to a kid. So it's like radically simplified language as produced by an LLM, completely grammatical, extremely boring and hackneyed. 29 million words of stupid dialogues about stuff. And I can tell you more about this, but it doesn't really matter. And then we also trained on basic Wikipedia stuff. And so the very simple thing you can say is like, is this better training data from the kids versus Wikipedia? And better training data for what? Well, we used 2 basic benchmarks here. One will come back again called Zorro, which is just about learning grammar. It's just a grammatical sentence contrasted with an ungrammatical sentence. You ask the model which one is better. It's minimal pairs. And then the other one is trying to extract a word similarity space to just get a sense of whether dog is more similar to ball than to cat or something like this from the models, and you can compare that to human judgments. Okay, so the basic result is the data don't make too much difference here, and to the extent that they do, Wikipedia is better than child language for GPT-2. It's not, I don't mean in general, I just mean for this model, but it's not, our indications are if you raise a GPT model with child language, they don't learn better. There's not something magic about the child language compared with anything else. So that kind of kills off one hypothesis that we initially had. I don't know if you had that hypothesis, but we did. And I'll say this very briefly. The developmental ordering didn't matter very much either. If anything, when you randomize childless, like so that the model sees sometimes sentences to 5-year-olds, sometimes to 1-year-olds, versus if you stage it out 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, the random order, if anything, is better, which people in machine learning knew for years, but it's true of child language as well. Okay. But there are limits to this kind of unimodal training data. One big complaint about LLMs in comparison to humans is they literally just experience predicting the next word in language, written language, or transcripts of spoken language. So what about what kids see? What about this grounding that we were talking about? Well, a really nice method for measuring grounded language, is to use footage from the child's own perspective. This is known as egocentric camera recordings, baby cam. So this, I didn't make up this method. This was pioneered by folks like Linda Smith and Chen Yu and Karen Adolph, Dick Gaslin, a variety of others. Really wonderful pioneering work on this. I adopted this method and created a camera for this when I started my lab. And we recorded videos that look kind of like this, shaky cam, baby cam. But they reiterate the general sense that people have had in this literature, which is that babies see the world in a way that's somewhat different than us. They've got these little tiny dinosaur arms. So when they hold objects, right, if you have dinosaur arms, everything is really close to your face, and that's really different than for adults. And they live in this world of knees where people, if they see people, they're mostly seeing people's hands, like sticking stuff in their face. So life is a little different as a baby, and that's cool. So we gathered a corpus of data called SayCam. It was about 450 hours, 470 hours of data from 3 kids, recording 2 hours a week from when their kid was 6 months old until 30 months. And the resolution's not great. It's relatively low quality. I didn't play you the audio because it's very bad. This is a very hard experiment to do, so the participants were 3 developmental psychologists taping their own kids. And the data, many people had collected data like this, but we shared the data openly and became the largest such data set that was available to researchers. So these data are good for some things. One thing that we thought was cool to do with them, this is the work of Bria Long, was to look at what social information the kids had access to. And 450 hours, you can't code that by hand. So we used computer vision models to identify hands and faces of people in here. The accuracy of this process wasn't great, but it was okay, and it wasn't super biased. And that allowed us to look at these 3 kids and see that across their development, they typically had more access to hands relative to faces. There were more of them in their field of view, and that confirmed this finding that had previously only been seen in sort of cross sections of kids. So you got to see that this was true continuously in development. But these videos weren't that great for measuring other things like objects in the view of the kid. The videos were too low resolution. So here's an example of a computer vision algorithm saying that this is a pizza. The view angle was very challenging for computer vision, and in general, infants see some objects way more than others, so computer vision algorithms weren't very good at this. Like, babies see the same stuffed animal a lot. They don't see like 10,000 examples of stuffed animals. Okay, but we were still able to train some models on these data. So this is an example of a model trained on headcam data. This is from Chung-Shu Shuang and Dan Yeamans, collaborators of mine at Stanford. So they trained some, at the time, state-of-the-art contrastive learning algorithms. These are computer vision algorithms that learn in an unsupervised way, kind of analogously to LLMs, but from vision data. What they're trying to do is, it's not exactly a prediction objective, it's a kind of grouping objective. So they're trying to group together images that are deemed to be more similar and pull apart images that are deemed to be more different. I'm happy to say more about this if folks have questions. But they're generally algorithms that try to kind of do unsupervised clustering on visual input. And they found that some of these algorithms, when trained on SayCam, did decently well, not amazingly, but decently well on predicting actually neural responses in the visual system. That's also true for supervised algorithms. That black bar is a supervised algorithm trained on ImageNet, which is a big resource for computer vision. This one's an unsupervised algorithm trained on ImageNet. And here's the SayCam results, which are good but not awe-inspiring. They weren't as good as these, but they were better than a whole bunch of other baselines. So we did this study, and Dan said, well, you spent all this time doing SayCam, but it's kind of low resolution, and it's actually not very much data. Could you get me a lot more data and make the data a lot better? And so that's basically what I've been doing for the past 5 years. Kind of kidding, but kind of not. Even given that, you guys are a tough audience. Even given that, There have been some successes. So there's a paper last year about this time that trained a multimodal LLM, a vision language model, on just one kid, just kid S from this corpus, and actually got some pretty interesting learning results from that, showing that you could learn sort of simple word grounding of a word in some kind of visual schema from these data. So that was a pretty cool demonstration that some kind of bare bones, like LLM type learning, could actually recover some word meanings, at least matching a word to an image, which is often all we ask of kids at this age anyway. So that was a pretty neat result. Okay, but I've told you a couple of foreshadowing things for why these data are bad. Of course, that's because we're trying to get better data. I want to tell you why the new data are good. This is still Bria Long's work. So we worked with Daylight Design, which is a design firm, to create this helmet mounting for a GoPro. So you spend a lot of time on design, it turns out you end up with something that looks very simple, but that's a positive thing. This is a baby crash helmet that they sell on Amazon. Some people are really worried that their babies will crash when they're learning to walk, and so they make these soft baby helmets. They're kind of comfy, and importantly, when you're working with toddlers who hate having helmets on, those holes in the helmet, they can accommodate Croc charms. Croc charms are the little decorations you put on your Crocs, and you can put them on there, and the kids will then wear the helmet, even if they otherwise hate headgear. Okay, so the Baby View is based on this ultra lightweight GoPro. It's a drone camera. It's easy to build and easy to deploy. It's just got one 3D printed mount. It's got a gyroscope and accelerometer, which is nice. It's higher resolution. And because of all these features, we're able to construct bouquets of Baby Views and mail those out to people around the country and occasionally around the world to put on their kid or not put on their kid or try and fail to put on their kid to gather data for us. So as of now, I guess 2 months ago, we had gathered around 800, almost 900 hours of home recordings from kids between roughly 6 months and 2.5, 3, as well as one individual person who used a different camera and gathered 70 hours. And then we also got a bunch of video from a preschool. There's a whole story about getting consent for all those that I could tell you at some other point. So we have more than 1,000 hours of Baby View. And the footage look a little different, I think better in a lot of ways. One thing you might notice is that it's a portrait view rather than a landscape. So we turned the camera around to gather more of that vertical field of view that has sometimes people up here and hands and objects down here. So here's Bria's daughter wearing this camera.
Oh, it's a dinosaur? Look, it's them and this. Yeah. Dinosaur.
So nice little piece of relational reasoning happening there caught on camera. So you see this bigger field of view vertically, which is quite useful from the perspective of studying the social information the kids get. So there are about 25 families contributing here. They're mostly highly educated. They're mostly white, Asian, and mixed race. It's just really hard to get people to do this experiment. So we've tried very hard to get a very diverse representative group, and we can't. That's what it is, but it's something that I want to note that it's something we've worked on and failed at. All the recordings are at home. All the adults have given consent. Parents get a whole bunch of opportunities to remove videos or flag videos not to be uploaded or just not upload them around the process. And then 6 months after they upload, the videos are eligible for release through databrary.org, which is an access-restricted data sharing site. And so you can see one thing that makes these data valuable is that we've got these long longitudinal traces for a lot of kids. Kids drop out, kids come in, but overall we've got a bunch of families who've contributed quite a large amount of data, which is exciting and provides a lot of opportunities for in-depth analysis. These data are way better for detecting objects and detecting people. Computer vision has gotten better, but also the data are just better. So here's an example of a video with those pose detections on it. They're a little small, but you can kind of see the child's arm is being detected there. And then you can see mom and other child being detected as separate people, their skeletons. So this is very useful for mapping the child's social input. So now we can actually train some language models on these data. These data, of course, only have speech. They don't have transcripts, but we can use automatic speech recognition models like Whisper, which is an OpenAI product, but is openly available. Whisper gives us decent transcripts. They're not great. They make a lot of errors on children's speech, but so do professional transcribers. It's just really hard to know what little kids are saying. And when we train language models here, we get interesting scaling estimates. So probably scaling is still too slow. This is on grammaticality judgments again. But you can try to compare this curve to what you think kids know. And so that's what's in progress for us, is to try to figure out, well, OK, this is like a 5-year-old worth of data. How high should a 5-year-old be on this graph? And so how big is that data gap? We have the sense that there's some data gap there. We just don't know exactly how big it is yet. So that's the kind of thing that we've tried to do. We've also tried to train computer vision models here. So here, this is a little bit more involved. We take all the data from SACAM, and at the time, what we had for BabyView, we train on subsets, again, to create these scaling curves. We use a self-supervised model. This is a little bit fancier than in the previous one I showed you. And then we can do a bunch of downstream tasks. So classifying images, estimating depth. These are kind of standard tasks in computer vision. And so here you see this is object recognition accuracy based on the hours of video that the model has received. This is a kind of a top line for a fancy model in orange, and human performance here for adults is in green. And what you basically see here is that these scaling curves for the BabyView data are actually very shallow. So even with just a ginormous amount of video here, like lifetimes of video, these models wouldn't achieve human-like performance. So here, this I think is a pretty strong negative result in comparison to the language one, which is much weaker. Here we see that these models clearly don't scale very well to the kind of data we have. And so you're going to need a different kind of architecture to learn better from child egocentric video than this one. So I think that's an interesting start, and then we can try to look for other architectures. And that's technical work that's we collaborate on, but are not in the lead on.
The human performance there, is evaluated at how much level of experience?
These are experiments that computer vision people have done where they get naive adults to categorize, like, this is top 5 accuracy. So this is like the human adults are giving guesses about which category an image is. So they see like some image and they're like, I think that's a cactus, but if it's not a cactus, it's an aloe. It's not an aloe, it's a whatever. And then they, they're really good at that. So in fact, it's almost tautological because the categorization is presumably designed by some graduate student who's not that different than the person doing the experiment. So these tests are not super hard to do. And similarly, depth estimation and semantic segmentation, these are like figuring out the boundaries of an object or figuring out how far away something is. These are things that people are really good at. So we don't know what the exact top line is, but we know these models are not anywhere near human performance. Their error is very bad on depth, and they're not good at segmenting images, and humans are really perfect at saying where the edges of objects are. Okay, let me show you one result just because it's cool. This is quite sketchy and new and early. So I've told you that this is not the right way to train models, that this is a gap in the standard operating procedure of training vision models and what we expect should produce human performance. This is just an example of the kind of thing that people have done. This is a paper where they added video prediction encoding to their model, and they see this little bump off of the scaling curve. So that dot there is a video model compared to the image model in one of these categorization tasks. And so that's the kind of thing you can do. You could say, oh, if I tell the model that there's video and I can predict temporal continuity in video, I do a little bit better than if I just assume it's all images. That's sort of a technical result at present, but it suggests that there's information in prediction in time that's important for a learner. Okay, so following that intuition, this is a very, very recent technical development, which is a model that's been trained by Dan Yeamans and a graduate student that works with him and me, Kai Long Ao, on 800 hours of baby view. So Kai took this, a masked temporal prediction algorithm. I'm not going to tell you the details, but I'm happy to come back to them. This is a temporal prediction algorithm that tries to predict what the next frame is, kind of like language models try to predict what the next word is. And then you can ask that model, okay, what if the next frame were different than you thought it was? What if it, for example, what if in the next frame this patch of this jacket was moved up here? And then you can say, okay, what should the next frame look like given that? And you get out this frame where the jacket is predicted overall to move up. Similarly, you can say, what if the camera panned up over here? What if the camera moved up? This is what the model thinks is happening above that part of the frame. I don't know what is actually happening. It's somebody's house that I've never been to, but this doesn't seem like a terrible guess. The door frame continued up a little bit further and so forth. Okay, why would we want to do this? Well, because it allows us to do actual cognitive evaluation. When we have babies, we can actually ask about their predictions and what surprises them. This is the kind of experiment that you do with babies in the cognitive science literature. So this is a classic experiment on infants' causal perception where you show them the white thing whacking into the black dot here, and then the black dot moves. And then you can reverse the order and see if they're surprised by that reversal and so forth. These kinds of experiments have been used to argue that babies understand that the first thing is causing the second thing to happen, and if you change that, they find it surprising. So we can do that same kind of thing with this model, where we actually ask about what the model predicts in collision scenarios. This literally, the model is generating this frame. So Kai took a picture of an orange and a kiwi on his counter, and then asked the model to generate that, what comes next. And it's moving both of them consistent with some kind of collision. So that's kind of a fun and surprising result. This is the kind of thing where I probably should show you what goes wrong when this doesn't work in smaller models. Like normally, if you say what happens when the hand moves, the model just stretches the handle out, or the cup collapses into nothingness, or you get this orange kiwi mixture that just happens in that space, right? The idea that it's individuating these objects and they're moving together is actually very exciting. Similarly, it can do a little bit of prediction about something being in a bowl. Because the alternative is the orange just stays put and the bowl stretches or falls apart or whatever. There's all kinds of weird alternatives. So this was an exciting preliminary result. And here's an example failure case, just in case you thought everything was perfect. So here we've said, what if that block in the middle moves? Now, if you know anything about physics or intuitive physics, the blocks underneath should not move, but they do. So really big, cool models that are not trained on baby view do actually move only the blocks on top and not the blocks underneath. But this one doesn't totally work. It doesn't know about physics yet. It moves like some chunk of the tower sort of arbitrarily. So anyway, this is the kind of stuff that we're doing. I'm not showing you this because it's a result yet. It's the direction we're going in, which is to train a model on what children experience and then to evaluate it in ways that children are evaluated. All right, that's the end of this piece of the talk. Let me pause here for questions about this bit, and then I'll talk at less length about evaluation in the last part.
The SACAM data, have you been able to find any correlations between like visual environments and vocalizations, for example?
Yeah, that was a major early goal when we started planning that study. And we were very, very interested in that. And we planned that study in 2012. We started it in 2013. And since then, I'll just tell you about my evolution here as a scientist. I came to realize how that design idea in this particular context was unlikely to be successful or convincing, to basically because of the fact that we have 3 kids. So it's really hard, the kind of predictive analysis that I was hoping to do would rely on the variability in outcomes across a sample of kids, and we didn't have that. So an alternative approach, which we've used occasionally when we didn't have that kind of thing, I'm going to move so you're not mesmerized by the oranges and kiwis, was to try to predict which words were easier or harder. And that is the kind of thing that we'd like to do. It requires triangulating each word in the transcripts with high accuracy, which we can't do in SACAM because the audio are too bad. And also requires triangulating the reference, the input about those words in the videos, which we couldn't do because it was too hard to get object detections to work. So that's something we're hopeful we can do in the BabyView data, where we've got better, not perfect audio, but better audio and better transcripts, and substantially better video where we can do object detection. So still the dream. I think it's the right question, and SACAM turned out not to be doable. BabyView, it's maybe doable, but still very hard. Yeah, Clark.
Is there any worry or discussion about the degree to which those videos might not actually match baby's actual vision because there's no saccades, and it also seems like it looks warped in some way that maybe doesn't.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
definitely so.
I don't know what the differences would be from what the baby's actually seeing, but
SACAM was fisheyed in order to increase the field of view, and it still was much smaller than the field of view that a human has access to, but it's also not, as you say, filtered through our attentional lens. We can refilter a model. These models actually, in some cases, have literally something called attention, right, where they're focusing different amounts of predictive juice on different parts of the image. So that's not necessarily a critical lack here, but the images are definitely different. I think that mattered a lot, especially in early headcam studies where the field of view was very small. That really actually may have underestimated the information that was available to babies. Overestimating it, I'm more comfortable with. I'm okay, because like I said, I think sort of similar to the answer I gave previously, since the models are still bad, like if they were radically better than people, then we'd be like, well, okay, let's see if the data were too rich. But since the models are still so much worse, we're not even making use of all that extra data that we give them. So I think that's there's a mismatch in both directions. I'm currently focusing on the inefficiency rather than the efficient, Yeah. Great. Okay. So I don't know how much folks read the internet around here, like scrolling on, but there was a period on Twitter, back when it was called Twitter, when there were a lot of tweets that looked sort of like this. Like, I let GPT-6 watch Disney's Moana and it cried at the end, and I think it's got human emotions. It's like, there's a lot of homuncular LLM type of stuff happening. So the literature has come a long way since these tweets. 2023 was basically like 2 decades ago in AI years. A lot has been published since then, but there's still quite a lot of challenges around trying to figure out what capacities AIs actually have. So one thing that I think is worth saying is that a lot of the same experimental design principles that we use in psychology and cognitive science are really very valuable when they're applied to LLMs. So we care about something called data contamination when we think about working with babies. That's why we teach them words like blicket. It's so that the first time they hear the word is in the lab with us. And similarly, a lot of these early evaluations, failed to do this kind of thing. And so they'd use materials that the LLM actually had in its training data because it literally read the scientific paper about the experiment that the researcher was then trying to conduct on the LLM. So it's important to avoid this kind of data contamination by using novel materials. With LLMs, developmental psychologists often use also schematic stimuli. This is an important practice. They have control conditions, which is surprisingly uncommon in LLM evaluation. We often try to evaluate models and humans, or we should try to evaluate models. We do try to evaluate humans using multiple tasks to tap the same latent construct. And then we also often measure dose response functions in humans, where we try to titrate some learning input and try to understand its consequences for the measurement that we're interested in. So what I've been engaged in is trying to figure out how to apply these experimental design ideas to models and what happens when you fail to, basically. So here's a first result. When we were working with kids, we worry about something called task demands, which is basically asking too complicated a question to the kid. So if you're trying to do an experiment with kids and you're maybe interested in probing their knowledge about morality or causal reasoning or any kind of conceptual domain, but you make the test really complicated, they could just fail because the test is complicated, not because they don't understand the concept. So that's sometimes known as task demands, the intuitive idea that maybe it's just too hard to remember what you asked or the question was too complicated. Turns out that exact same thing happens with language models, especially when you're trying to study smaller language models. So people have actually done this kind of thing. If you're interested in, say, language prediction, you can ask a language model, what word is most likely to come next in the following text? I take my coffee with cream and blank. So then if you give a prediction, the language model output sugar. But alternatively, if you don't want to ask this whole question to the model, this is literally a question that you could paste into ChatGPT. But if you don't want to ask that question and you want to minimize the demand on the model of understanding this passage, then you might actually just condition the model on these words and look at its output probabilities. So this is examining the probabilities from the actual neural network rather than looking at the language it generates. These two tasks have two different kinds of demands, both for models and for people. For people, if you have to answer the verbal response, you have to produce some language and so forth. This is quite a tricky task, and that's why in psycholinguistics we mostly have people, for example, we measure their evoked potentials when they hear I take my coffee and with cream and sugar versus I take my coffee with cream and dog. Right, you get this little kind of signal in a variety of different implicit measures. So reaction time, event-related potentials, eye movements, all of these can provide implicit signals that signal that not just competent adults, but also kids or even infants have some language prediction going on. So the simplified task works well with humans. It turns out this also works well with models. So our prediction was that with both age of a kid or with model size or training, performance should be higher with a low task demand task than the high task demand task. That seems obvious. But it should be especially impaired for the high demand task for smaller models and for younger kids. That's the general idea. And so in this study, which was done with Jen Hu, we showed that language models actually do show the same kind of task demand gap where there's a big difference for small models on word prediction tasks, on grammatical judgment tasks, and on a bunch of reasoning tasks as well that we looked at. So basically, you have to be really careful how you ask the question to both language models and to human children. So how should we evaluate models? What do we do with kids when we want to avoid task demands? Mostly, we use very simple multimodal choice paradigms. Like this is my bread and butter as a developmental psychologist studying language. If you want to know whether a kid knows the word chair, you show them a picture of a chair and a ball and you say, look at the chair. If they look at the chair, you get some prima facie evidence they understand the word. So that kind of multimodal forced choice is what we do with kids across a lot of ages. So we basically decided to try to evaluate language models in precisely this way. We created what we call DevBench. It's a developmental benchmark for language models, where we took a bunch of forced choice multimodal paradigms. Look at the ball versus the apple. Choose the aloe. This is for slightly older kids. Or for grammar understanding, the boy the dog chases is big. Kind of a tricky sentence that tells us whether the children or models are understanding the way the word order works in English. So we took a bunch of these tasks that have been done with kids and adults, and we also took data from kids and adults, and we tried to evaluate how well language models, these are multimodal models now, actually could predict the response distribution that kids and adults did. So just to zoom in here, this is the looking while listening paradigm that's commonly used with very young children, where you go look at the ball. This one is the visual vocabulary task that we developed, which is a pointing task where you say, point to the aloe or touch the aloe. Here's what that looks like in practice. This is again with Bria's kids. Usually this would be done in a more controlled setting, but it's kind of cute. So.
this the milk ceremony?
I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah.
There you go. So aggregating across a bunch of kids, you get a response distribution. And you can then measure the similarity or dissimilarity between the errors that the LLM makes and the errors that the kids make. So some kids choose knee there, but as you saw, she almost doesn't choose the other thing. So there's some response distribution that you see across kids that varies by age. And so you can look at the divergence between LLM responses and kid responses. And this gives us a little bit of a window into what makes LLMs good at, or these are VLMs, vision language models, good at matching human performance. Really, this is an attempt at constructing a benchmark that can be used by anybody. So this is a kind of set of data and evaluations that can be downloaded by somebody developing a model to compare to human performance. So it's not just kind of, we benchmarked a bunch of existing models, but we're hoping that new models that come out use our benchmark and try to actually evaluate how well they match what humans and human kids do. So it turns out that better models are more human-like here. When we look at the correlation, this is a correlation between the models and the humans across all of these different tasks that make up the benchmark. The feature of the models that correlates most with the model's score on the benchmark is how good the model is. So that's a funny and sort of tricky result, which is better models also relate to humans better. In contrast, bigger models, like just in terms of more parameters, that's like slightly correlated for some tasks, but it's not as much. And more training data didn't appear to correlate as well. So this actually reiterates a finding that's been shown in a number of other model building domains, which is making a model that is just overall performing better at some task, like language prediction or image classification, actually tends to predict human behavioral and neural responses better. Second finding, better models tend to be more adult-like. So this is just for that visual vocabulary word task. What's plotted here on the x-axis is accuracy, and on the y-axis is model human dissimilarity. So lower dissimilarity is better. And what we see is that across models and across ages, overall, better models, that is higher accuracy, have lower dissimilarity. So that's kind of finding one. Finding two, there's this kind of interesting little crossover here, which is that less good models tend to be even worse at predicting adults. And to the extent that they're good, they're better at predicting kids. So the bad models are slightly better at predicting kids, and the good models are better at predicting adults. So there's a little bit of a model development kind of finding here. And you actually see this even within an individual model called OpenClip, which is the only one we can do this with because we have a bunch of its training runs, so we can look at its own developmental trajectory. And so this is for a visual vocabulary. Or this one's for the grammar task. You can see its dissimilarity to humans goes down across development, so it's kind of getting closer to the human data. The human data here are from 12-year-olds. And then here's the vocabulary one where you see that same crossover. It's worse at predicting adults at the beginning and better at 4-year-olds, and then there's crossover and it gets really good at predicting adults and not as good at predicting 4-year-olds. So it's kind of an interesting window into the development of these models. Okay, so this is almost where I'm going to end. This is a benchmark that helps us compare models to humans. I just want to show you again, that each project is that the flaws of each project lead to the next plausible step. So there are a couple problems with this particular project here. One of them is just that it's all just a bunch of tasks that we found. These are data that we had in our pockets for one reason or another. They were out there, had been released by some group, or that we had collected, but they're not coordinated. You can see I've got the 4-year-olds and the 7-year-olds and the 10-year-olds in this task. I just didn't have them in this task, so I couldn't do that plot, and so forth. So what we really want is actually coordinated data collection across many different kids at many different ages. And ideally, we want that across not just English learning kids in one high SES context like this. We want that across many different populations. So I'm just going to end by telling you a little bit about a project that attempts to get those data. That's the Levante project. Levante stands for Learning Variability Network Exchange. This is an ongoing project that my lab is the data coordinating center for. So we've built over the last 2 years a technical platform for data collection and sharing. This is a website basically with a lot of tasks for kids. And that website contains internationalized versions of tasks that are openly available, that are free, that are open source with permissive licenses. And then the Jacobs Foundation, our partner in this, is assembling a network of teams that are going to use our technical tools to collect data. So basically, we're building a platform, and then they're throwing the party to invite people to come and play on our playground. So there are about to be 8 first-round sites released. So the decisions, people have applied for grants. There are about 200 applicants for the grants. I think 8 of these sites will be funded in the first round. We expect another 8 per year for at least 3 years. So then there'll be 24 sites collecting data with our framework under the provision that they are going to release all of their data. So all of the research products under Levante, including code, data, and so forth, are all available free of charge and open source. And then the core measure data get released on a 6-month schedule, rather than waiting for somebody to publish on their data collection. In practice, what does this look like? It's things like hearts and flowers. That's an inhibitory control task. But it's also social cognition. So this is a theory of mind storybook task, a matrix reasoning task, kind of like Raven's progressive matrices, that grammar task that you saw from Visual Vocab, from the DevBench piece just a moment ago. And all of these are already translated into English, Spanish, and German, and we anticipate French and 2 other languages in this next wave. These are tablet tasks. They can be used on a tablet or a computer. And we are currently piloting them with kids in Colombia, in Canada, and in Germany. So here are just a few of the pilot data. Here you can see there's between sort of 300 some and up to 700 or 800 kids in some of these tasks, ranging from the executive function ones to math, spatial cognition, language. There's some reading tasks that aren't shown here, as well as theory of mind. So this is ongoing work where we're piloting these tasks, both to measure learning variability globally and also as first steps towards AI evaluation using open data from kids around the world. So very, very early days for this kind of work, but we're excited to construct what we might think of as a second DevBench that has more representative sample of tasks and kids. All right, so I argued from this idea of a data gap between kids and LLMs that we might measure that data gap precisely and then use it as a metric for comparing kids and models, and that might tell us about the basic questions around the nature of learning and knowledge. I didn't show you answers there yet. I think that's going to take a while, but I hope that you think this is at least an interesting paradigm. And at the heart of this paradigm is the fundamental thesis, which I tried to argue, which is that in order to achieve scientific use of these exciting, weird, crazy, problematic models that we're grappling with, we need to train them on kids' data, and we need to evaluate them on kids' learning outcomes. Okay, thanks to everybody who contributed and to you for listening.
Time for questions.
Thanks, this is really interesting, all of it. I guess I have kind of a 2-part question. The first one is really simple clarification, but when you're looking at, when you're evaluating model performance, it's really always just the output is accurate or not. Is that the only measure?
So for this last chunk that I was showing you, this is a funny benchmark. So there are a lot of benchmarks in machine learning where the question is the thing that model does right? This benchmark, in contrast, says, what did the model choose? And if it didn't choose the right answer, what were its mistakes? So this is, in the example of like the allo case. So maybe this is, this is the model choosing aloe, proportion of the model choosing aloe, and this is the 4-year-old choosing aloe. But then or let's say this is the 4-year-old, this is the model. Then the 4-year-old chooses cactus, and the model doesn't. The model's choosing whatever that was, bracket instead. So the divergence between those two distributions is what's being modeled here. So that's what makes this DevBench idea a little more unique. It's not, hey, does the model know the word aloe? It's, does it have the right concept of aloe in the sense that does it make the right mistakes when it doesn't know?
Digging deeper into accuracy, you can look at the mistakes. But is there any variability in the time it takes the model to come up with the answer?
So when you interact with a commercial product like ChatGPT, there are a bunch of things that contribute to the latency of generation. Basically, that's about the size of the model combined with the compute resources that are being used, combined with the scheme for allocating those requests to their server farm. So that's a real rough thing to what you can look at are things like the uncertainty of the distribution that comes out. Again, that's hard with ChatGPT, but if you have an open model, you can do 10,000 runs of aloe versus cactus and look at the proportions that come out. So there is some sampling that's happening there to try to understand the nature of like how certain the model is, what the breadth of its distribution is. And that is the kind of thing that we use here because any given sample from the model just gets you one answer. To get this distribution, we need to sample from it hundreds or thousands of times for each example to try to figure out how much weight on aloe versus on cactus versus on bracket.
I mean, I ask because that one video of the little girl, you really see all this stuff like her movements indicate something about her thought processes, kind of like mouse tracking stuff, and then, obviously you can measure the eye movements and stuff. But I guess so. My bigger question is there any thought or effort towards maybe collaborating with AI developers to make your own AI models where you have access to some of the even though I know it's machine learning, so you'll never know some things. And so maybe where you have more control over the architecture and then you can start testing models within architectures that you understand.
Yeah, so this piece of work here, which is very new ongoing work, is an example where this is a model that's trained in a bespoke way on just our data. So this model is making, this Kiwi type stuff, that's coming out of being trained on 800 hours of just kids video. And that's what makes this exciting to me is this is a result not being produced by Sora from OpenAI, but by the thing that Kai trained on our local GPU resources in order to try to understand what's possible from truly naturalistic data.
Is there control over some aspects of the training?
100%. So this is a training run that has been set up by
the mechanism that's actually doing the training. You can modify that as well.
Yeah. So this is a brand new training objective that Dan Yeaman's lab has designed for video prediction. And the idea behind it is that it's slightly closer to the kind of prediction error based visual learning that biological organisms might do. Sure.
Yeah, so this was really exciting. There's a long tradition in cognitive science, of course, to devise models for very narrow phenomena and often very simple models. And so in a sort of playful consideration, you can imagine taking many of these models of language learning or others, and they would fail at almost all these tasks. Typically, they're only tailored to very specific kinds of domains. On the other hand, now you're dealing with computational systems that are mass scale and complex and so on and so forth. And so some might attribute to these models the characteristic of being sort of engineered machine learning systems. And here I sort of sense that you're trying to pull it back into the cognitive modeling realm. But my question is just how do you contrast this distinction in modeling traditions? So one is, and of course you've contributed to both of these in many respects, you sort of devise highly distilled kinds of models that characterize particular phenomena. And here you have mass scale models that you hope will be able to characterize many phenomena. Where do you see this sort of juxtaposition in these traditions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So just to anchor you really far, or anchor the audience really far over on the mass modeling idea. There's a recent preprint where they take 100 different cognitive science and psychology tasks, like CogPsych, reaction time and decision-making tasks, and they describe all of them in natural language, and then they create essentially a training corpus that is each trial by each participant from some set of labs on these tasks. This is kind of found data, but aggregated together at very large scale. They take that and they use that as the fine-tuning data for Llama, which is the open source Meta AI, this is Llama 3, the most recent open source Meta AI equivalent of ChatGPT's underlying model. So they take a giant LLM trained on the entire internet, trillions and trillions of words of data. They fine-tune this on a giant mass of cognitive psychology data. And they find that this model now predicts the outcome of held out data from other experiments with much higher accuracy than anything else we have, including all of those small scale models that for each of those 100 phenomena somebody like some grad student like me or something had made. So this is a case where they are really trying to unify, but they're doing so using an artifact that's clearly kind of way out of scale. They've created a black box prediction agent that is able to make predictions about many, many different aspects of human cognition better than psychologists and their bespoke models can. But we don't totally understand. So that's kind of an anchor. And then the small scale models that I and many, many others make or made are over here. So yeah, how do you calibrate this general training paradigm that I've kind of advocated in this talk? I think is, as you say, an attempt to try to understand what is a cognitive modeling path that's intermediate between these two strategies. And the idea is that if we think that general reasoning capacities across many domains do emerge from learning, we should be able to evaluate those at a human scale of learning, as opposed to just at a humanity scale of learning. Yes?
It seems like the kind of thing that you were testing for was the quantity of data that the models had access to and the sort of learning curves over that. My sense from sort of more of an outsider's perspective is that there's a lot of stuff besides quantities, like order, structure, how the data is represented. You mentioned in passing kind of the active learning paradigm. I was wondering if any of that you've sort of looked at and whether these factors have a significant effect on the training curves.
Yeah, this study that I started with is maybe a weak attempt to test some of those things, which I think a lot of, I don't know if you're a psychologist, but a lot of psychologists have intuitions about. So many psychologists, many of my best friends have said things in print about the critical importance of social learning, the critical importance of active learning and curricularization of data, and general just the quality and supportive nature of human children's learning input across many different cultures and contexts. And so this very kind of, you have to forgive this is made as a machine learning paper, but the idea behind this machine learning experiment was, okay, we should be able to make our models do better than if we feed in kids' data in the order that kids get them. And the answer for this is largely a null result, but if anything, it's a negative result. The models do worse with kids' data, and they do slightly worse in kid order. And this graph, which I didn't explain just for time, is from this very nice Martinez et al. Paper that I was not involved in. They tried every possible, this is way more systematic than what we did, they tried every possible way of reordering data to try to feed into standard issue language models to try to make them learn better. And basically it's all null. They couldn't make ordering be the agent for this set of architectures. Now, I want to caution you, that does not mean that ordering is not important for human children. Could very well be, but it is not the panacea that explains the gap between current architectures and human children. In fact, it makes the current architectures do even worse. So at a minimum, we need to find other things. Maybe if we fix the learning rules for these architectures, then all of a sudden, if they have the right memory and attention, then the ordering will matter, and then it'll work out. But it's not the first thing we should look for because it doesn't even go in the right direction, unfortunately. This is, when people show null results, sometimes it masks the 2 years of efforts to make the null result not a null result because they thought that was the right hypothesis. That's the case here. I thought this was the right hypothesis, and I'm a little dispirited that it's not. Anne, go ahead.
I feel like it's maybe a little premature to give up on the idea that there might be some interactions between the specifics of a particular human being, where they're at in their learning, or where the model is at in its trajectory. But anyways, that's what I was gonna ask a question. So this is all really amazing and great to see all the updates. I was curious about the variation that you see across babies and or children, sorry, obviously, but just children, our participants. And like if you thought about maybe trying to make that an additional target for your model, like what kinds of variables you would manipulate to try to match that variation?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question, and it's been a focus a lot of my non-LLM related research. But in this case, I haven't started there, and I think that's because I don't know what the right levers are to pull in order to explain variability. So here's maybe the biggest finding from my previous body of work, or one important finding from my previous body of work that I didn't tell you at all about, but even though I spent the last 10 years on it, is I get together data on kids' vocabulary around the world, and no matter where you look in the world, if you look at toddlers, they're all over the place with respect to language. Some of them can talk and some of them can't. And when I first started studying that, I thought people in the US are very diverse and different from each other, and they raise their kids differently, and that's why kids are all over the place, and that's not true. Their kids are all over the place everywhere, to a shockingly similar degree in the extent of variability. And they're not all over the place with learning to walk, like most kids learn to walk at their first birthday, right? A couple months early, a couple months late. But the standard deviation is not so big. But if you look at a milestone like saying 200 words, the standard deviation is much, much bigger. Okay, so how do we model that? In the LLM context, we can do things like changing the amount of data. That's really one of our levers to pull here. And that's an interesting one to pull, but there's a long-running argument in developmental psychology, which I know you're aware of, that changing the amount of data is not exactly what explains that variability in kids. So I think it would be really fun to try to make variability a locus of investigation, but it would require a lot of just basic trying to poke around and understand, what are the variables we'd want to manipulate in model training land to reproduce that. Yeah, maybe now that you've said this is a good idea, and somebody should do it. Maybe you, maybe me, but yeah.
Really, really fantastic talk, and so many interesting avenues to travel with this underlying paradigm. I was wondering if you feel that the set of large language models, or just this set of network structures that are built into such models, is sufficiently analogous to the human brain, let's say, to shed some light on the question of what are big brains for. So if we have, for example, tripling a brain size in a couple million years, one really outstanding question is, what good is this vastly larger and very costly brain for? And since you were looking at both performance in language tasks as well as other sorts of tasks, I was wondering if there's work that's explored, like the silicon analogy of what we think happened in human brain evolution, like an overall increase in the size of the brain, perhaps reorganization of certain areas of the brain. Is there anything in the data that you've looked at or studies that you're aware of that look at, like for example, is there something about the language learning task that puts a prime value on increasing numbers of parameters, or something about the structure of the network where the language task in particular is going to have some impact, or have some special different impact on the structure or size of the network?
Yeah, this is a fabulous and hard question. Okay, so first thing to say about this is neural networks that are used in modern language models are really very dissimilar to human brains in a lot of ways. They are maybe not a horrible zeroth order approximation, but they learn via backpropagation of error, which is not a biologically plausible learning rule. Their scale is not right in terms of time and data usage and training steps. They often walk through the data many times in order to kind of wring the most juice out of it. So there's many different reasons why they're just different than brains. Second point is that despite that, maybe even sometimes because of that, they become a really interesting tool for exploring the nature of what intelligences can be like. I think sometimes somewhat like the way looking at collective intelligence or octopus intelligence can also help us think about what are the scope and limits of being smart generally. Maybe it's a colony of ants being smart, or a slime mold, or an octopus with its legs, but it's still producing adaptive behavior in a context. And that's, to me, fascinating and can shed light on some of your questions, maybe. In that spirit, the kind of last thing that I'd mention is that maybe you know this already, and I apologize, but to me, the deepest insight from studies of LLM size, or let's say more generally neural network size, is this phenomenon called double descent. So when I, not that long ago, took classes in machine learning, there was a paradigm that said, okay, your model should not have very many free parameters, right? Because if you have too many free parameters, you can overfit to your data. You can predict all the data points. So classically, the teacher would start by saying, if you have as many free parameters as data points, each parameter can just be a data point, and you just have your data set. So you shouldn't have very many free parameters. And that's what I learned, and you minimize the free parameters, maximize the prediction. That's machine learning for you. Problem is, that doesn't totally account for what LLMs do. So there's this phenomenon called double descent. Let me see if I can draw it backwards, which is, this is prediction error, this is the curve, and this is the number of parameters. And classic machine learning goes, and then it levels off. And if you're going out of sample prediction error, if you get too many, then it's kind of going to go up again because you're overfitting. You're compressing the data you have, and you don't generalize well, right? So that's the classic, trade-off. But what if you got way more parameters, like billions more parameters than your data set had? It turns out, and this is the neural network thing, it goes down again. That's real weird. And I think that's fundamentally crazy about big intelligence size, that you can actually compress other abstractions. You can learn all kinds of crazy stuff from the data that you're making up that's not in there when you've got enough capacity to represent that. And that's a fundamental insight that I think people are still grappling with and is really exciting. And I don't know if it has to do with biological evolution. I should have prefaced this all by saying I'm just speculating here, but that's where I go because I think that's fascinating.
I don't want to take the last question. I have one. So just the question of domain specificity. I was wondering, I know you haven't done this yet or nobody's done it, but how could you use these methods to get at this question of, maybe the simplest way of putting it is that there's a possibility that children are doing this better than LMs because they have some built-in priors, right?
Yeah.
So they're coming to the data. They're not a full blank slate, and these models, if I take it correctly, they are basically a blank slate with respect to the domain of language, right?
Yeah.
Can we reverse engineer the domain specificity of human language abilities using this?
Yeah, let me, okay. Let's talk about two domains, physics and grammar. Let's talk about grammar first and then physics. So question is, cognitive scientists have posited in the nativist tradition that there are innate and domain-specific constraints that help kids solve learnability puzzles, that it's really hard to learn about how the physical world works or how the grammar of a language works. I was going to show you data, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to say this. I think the learnability argument in grammar is gone. I think that people will disagree with me about this, but I grew up in cognitive science with a whole bunch of people saying languages are in principle unlearnable, There's these logical arguments for the poverty of the stimulus. You can't learn these things. I think that's all blown out of the water, like totally obviously. And people who are kind of arguing around the margins are arguing around the margins. This is my hot take for today. But I'm not even talking about GPT-4o, which can write a children's book for my 6-year-old with completely fluent English. I'm talking about like GPT-2 on 100 million words can also do grammaticality judgment at a decently high level. That's not what anybody would have predicted in that tradition. So my guess is that those, could there be domain specificity anyway, but you just don't happen to need it? Yeah, maybe, but all the learnability arguments that were levied in that literature seem to me to be prima facie wrong. Physical reasoning, up until like a few weeks ago, to be honest, I would have probably said I had some money, maybe not all my money, but a little bit of money on some more conceptual primitives speeding up visual learning. I showed you this Kiwi thing, which was not all that impressive, but I was kind of excited about it. But if you like more impressive things, there's a paper out of Facebook AI, like from 2 or 3 days ago, that has similar but vastly more advanced and impressive results on a variety of different case studies, where they're training on as little as 120 hours of video and as much as like 10,000 hours of video, and they're getting out physical predictions that model babies' judgments decently well. So jury is still out, but I think there were a lot of arguments in cognitive science of the form, man, it would be really hard to learn this, friends, with our current technology. And turned out those didn't age as well as I would have said in grad school. It's interesting to be wrong.
Okay, well, I think we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much. Very good.